Well, after being elected as the new national president for LULAC, Domingo Garcia made his way to Corpus Christi. Tonight, LULAC Council 1 held reception for him to meet local members, discuss his policy on different topics. Our Michelle Pedraza was there. Michelle.
Domingo Garcia has been a member of LULAC since he graduated from law school back in 1983. He was elected at this year's national convention with 68% of the votes. Garcia says he wanted to join LULAC to continue the organization's mission of fighting for social justice for civil rights. He wants to grow the league to 1 million members and have organizers in every state mobilizing and registering people to vote. Garcia supports comprehensive immigration reform and says there needs to be a bipartisan support when it comes to DACA. He also said that he is against the U.S.-Mexico border wall, saying that Mexico is our largest trading partner.
Mexico is our largest trading partner. The reason Texas has such a vibrant economy is because of Mexico. We sell more corn to Mexico than any other country on the planet. We sell more resources and goods to Mexico, and they're our neighbor. We treat neighbors with kindness and cordiality and hospitality. We don't build walls to separate us. It's misguided.
He goes on to say that money used to build the wall would be better used to build an infrastructure and help with the development of economies in other countries. Garcia plans to have staff lobbying in Washington to make sure politicians get the message about immigration, reform, DACA, and the wall. And he adds that he would like to recruit more of the younger generation. His end goal, to have a Latino or Latina elected as president of the United States. So a lot to look forward to in his time in office. Mackenzie.